Hello. My name is Lord Hardthrasher, and we will start the video in just a moment. But before we do, I'm doing a bit of a timey-wimey thing. I am trying to raise a few pounds, a few pence, a few dollars, a few cents for my friend Anna in Ukraine, who, as you may or may not be aware, I have raised money for before. Anna is attempting to buy batteries to help the soldiers on the front line in Ukraine resist the Russian invasion. We are talking today about the rise of authoritarianism, and there is no finer way to express your disgust at that sort of behaviour than to help Anna and her friends raise the money that they need to defend their homelands. So, if you are able to assist, I would be most grateful. And without further ado, back to the video. So this is a video that is not about the ME-163 comet. I mean, hopefully you know that because it's called Not a Video About the Comet. I was going to talk about that plane, but something happened, and normal service will be resumed, but this story is too interesting not to tell. The Comet was the first, and I think the only rocket-powered fighter ever to see combat, and well, look, I don't want to spoil things, but let's say there were one or two teeny-weeny problems. It had the world's first fully throttleable rocket engine, which is really cool, but it also had the endurance of a heavy smoker in a marathon, a fuel source that would either explode or digest the pilot, and sometimes both, a tailless design that wasn't actually tailless, and it required pilots to glide at several hundred miles an hour whilst making an attack run. Oh, and its guns were useless. And it had no landing gear. Look, it's quite the ride. We will come back to it, I promise, but not today. Today we're going to go down a rabbit hole together. The story of the ME-163 starts as most rocketry did way back in the mid-1920s and early 1930s, with tailless gliders and a lot of mad young men trying to bring the kaboom. Probably if you know only one name from the world of rockets, it'll be Wernher von Braun. Like, he's the daddy of German rocketry as far as the modern perspective goes, not least because he was involved with NASA and the Saturn V rocket that carried Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin and whatever the other bloke's name was to the moon. Again, a story for another day. But before Wernher shot for the moon, he often missed and hit London because he was also an SS officer who built the engine for the V2 ballistic missile. We will cover the V2 program probably at some point in the future, but for now let's just recognise that von Braun, as chief designer, oversaw the deaths of about 12,000 concentration camp prisoners at the Mittelbau Dora death camp cum manufacturing plant in 1944-45. So there are, let's say, some red flags here. In fact, there are more red flags here than a Moscow May Day parade. Before all of that, von Braun was involved with a group of keen young men in Germany who were studying engineering and playing with rockets in their spare time, just on the cusp of the Nazis taking over. And it is here that I came across the name Rolf Engel alongside von Braun's. Being a curious creature, I thought it would be good to do a quick piece of research, just a little sidetrack alongside the main thrust of things, if you'll forgive the pun, and it would take a few seconds of Googling, after which I could resume talking about the flying digester. And the result of that click was, well, basically every tiny bit of the Nazi state, concentration camps and the CIA. Being a chap about town, people often ask me simple questions, like, for example, Lord Hardthrasher, what are you doing in bed with my wife? Which I normally respond to by saying, go away, I'm busy. But they do also sometimes ask other questions, like, for example, what was it like to be in Germany during the rise of the Third Reich? And during the war, was it really that chaotic and strange? And my usual response is to say, please hand me my trousers. And sometimes they ask, always in an American accent, but surely the Nazis were socialists, right? At which point I generally signal for Jenkins to use his lead-filled sock on the back of their head. However, I do not have an assignation with your spouse today, and Jenkins is off for half-term, and thus perhaps we can use Rolf as an example, and through him examine some of those questions in a bit more detail. If I could pick literally any time and place to be born in human history, it sure as shit wouldn't be Europe from, say, 1880 to 1920. Rolf Engel was born to solidly middle-class parents in Mainz in 1912, e.g. at about the worst possible moment. By the time he was 6, the First World War was over and Germany was in a state of revolution. He was just 12 when Hitler first attempted to seize power in the Beerholt-Putsch in 1923. In 1928, Rolf joined an up-and-coming society of potential rocketeers, known as the Verein für Raumschifffahrt. For now, let's call them the VFR. So, the VFR were a group of like-minded individuals who thought that rockets would be the future and began to conduct really quite proper experiments on propellant types and rocket engines, launch vehicles, basically all the things that one might want to be able to do in order to be able to go to space. Or, launch missiles at one's neighbours, should one be so minded. Every month, the VFR would publish its imaginatively titled Die Rocket, or The Rocket, in which Rolf and every other egghead and nerd in the Weimar Republic, and actually quite a few overseas readers too, could learn about their latest wheeze, who'd strapped what to who with what results, and how they were very soon all going to be flying to Mars. Or, launching missiles at their enemies. That same year, a film called Frau in Mund was released, which featured quite a lot of rocket models actually built by the VFR. You can see it if you're curious. I put a link in the description. And it in turn inspired hundreds of people to start playing with their rockets all across Germany. And so somewhat inevitably, that in turn attracted the attention of the military, specifically the former head of the Army Ordnance Board. Now, look, okay, this is a serious video, we are having a serious chat, and we are not going to laugh at funny German names, okay? Are you ready? This gentleman's name was Hans Wolf von Dickuth-Harth. All right, settle down. Herr Dickuth took over the VFR slowly over the next 18 months or so, and he shut down Die Rocket and began a quiet program of experimentation, ostensibly to focus on the work better, but in reality to try and bring the weaponization of rockets to these nice young men. Anyway, weirdly, as Herr Dickuth took over, suddenly the VFR came into a load of additional funding. Gee, I can't imagine where that might have come from. Oh, except I can, because it turned out post-war that a chap called Karl Emil Becker was funding the whole thing from army coffers. Surprise! Meanwhile, two things happened. Firstly, Rolf, now aged 17, was sent to the Berlin Technical Institute and was part of the same class at the same time as Werner von Braun. And secondly, the entire global financial system crashed on its arse. The catastrophic nature of the 1929 Wall Street crash on Germany is hard to overestimate. And in an environment like that, where life is chaotic and stressful and difficult, the Nazis thrived. They blamed it all on Jewish bankers and the Versailles Treaty at the end of World War I. And so it was perhaps little wonder then that Rolf joined a student union, the Nationalschulitzer Deutsche Studenten. Now, if that sounds a little bit ominous, it probably should, because it's very close to the Nationalschulitzer Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, or as we like to call them, the Nazi Party. This name sometimes causes problems for folks in English. The translation is, after all, National Socialist German Workers' Party. People look at that and make an assumption that the words socialist and worker are in there, therefore this must be a left-wing setup. And this isn't really helped by the dichotomy in American politics, where there are really only two parties, with the Dems nominally on the left and the Republicans nominally on the right. Everything that's associated with their policy sets, therefore, is considered to be left or right, even if it isn't. And I don't want to disappear too far down this rabbit hole, but I do think there are one or two things in here worth considering. Firstly, the name. There were quite a few early Nazis who simply thought of what they were doing as socialism by another name, rather than focusing in on things like wealth and capital, which are the traditional domains of socialism, or something like, historical determinism, which is what Marx focused on. These people thought that they could focus instead on nationalism and anti-Semitism. Their goal wasn't an equal society, but one which had less Jewish people in it, and thus, in their twisted little minds, somehow that would make Germans more free, where they could thrive or something. Look, I'm not going to say any of that makes any sense, and I want to be absolutely clear this is an abhorrent and stupid view, but it was the view that these people held. Most notably amongst these, and I'm going to use the word thinker here, but I use that term extremely advisedly, were two brothers, Otto and Gregor Strasser, who were probably the most prominent of the so-called left wing of the Nazi Party in the 1920s. They weren't alone. Whilst Hitler was in prison following his hilariously inept attempt to overthrow the government in the Beer Hall Putsch, there was a proliferation of so-called roast beefs, that was people that wore brown shirts of the Nazis, but were thinking like communists on the inside. However, in December of 1924, after a mere 9 months, Herr Hitler emerged from jail. Whilst being incarcerated is never ideal, it actually worked out rather well for Adolf. Firstly, it made him a celebrity known and recognised beyond just Munich and Bavaria, which in turn cemented his control over the NSDAP. Secondly, it flushed out a bunch of naive fools like the Strassers and made them very easy targets over the next few years, and by 1930 they were a spent force in the party. Lastly, he had time to dictate what amounted to a political manifesto, Mein Kampf, which would essentially act as a blueprint for Hitler for the rest of his life. In it, he was explicit about a few things. Firstly, that the Jews were the root of all evil, and since Marxism and communism were also clearly evil, they must be Jewish. Or the other way around. Look, again, I'm not going to try and claim this makes any sense. Either way, in his mind, they had to be destroyed. Secondly, he wanted the Versailles Treaty to be destroyed as an affront to German dignity, because it too was clearly a Jewish conspiracy. Somehow. Thirdly, Germany apparently wasn't big enough. It needed more space, specifically space to the east where the Slavs and other degenerates could easily be enslaved for Germany's use. And then lastly, to do all of this, Germany needed to become a nation of the Volkengrossen, or a racial comrades, not one dominated by class struggle, just the indomitable will. As the 1934 slogan went, "Don't whinge, work." In other words, there was nothing in Hitler's plan about working for better wages for the working class, nor improved living standards for the poor, or creating an equal opportunity society for women, or generally making society more equal in total. In fact, he was explicitly opposed to all of those things. He rejected absolutely the idea of providing people with equal rights on any level, dividing the world up into the strong, so explicitly male, explicitly Aryan, who should take things by force and dominate everybody else, specifically the explicitly weak, and these included, for example, all women and all non-Aryans, and so on and so on. And these people should act as servants or slaves to the dominants. It's all, again, pretty Freudian stuff, and one cannot help but wonder whether or not it would have all simply gone away had Hitler just had access to a FetLife account. Part of the challenge here in thinking about the Nazis, especially in the modern world and especially in the United States, is it tends to be very hard for people to get their heads around the fact that some things which are labelled left and right are not, in fact, left and right policies. The term socialism, for example, has got so wrapped up in layers of meaning as to become completely divorced from what it actually means. Socialism is about making the world more equal by taxing the rich and spending on the poor. Everything else is just window dressing. Hitler wanted to destroy Marxism and Bolshevism not because they were the wrong kinds of socialists, but because he believed that socialism was a Jewish idea and as such it was abhorrent. In the same way that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea, uses the word democratic in its title in order to try and claim that it is in somehow ruled by its own people, whilst being nothing of the sort, the Nazis were quite happy to use terms like socialist and worker to get people through the door, make them feel part of the movement, with absolutely no intention of actually doing anything that was focused on socialism or workers. For example, party members were referred to as Kamerad. There was a lot of talk of the Volk, meaning Germanic people specifically. There were constant appeals to the collective responsibility, and so on and so on and so on. It's worth remembering that Hitler saw himself as right-wing, as do all credible historians today, because this wasn't a struggle about wealth. It was about race and German nationalism. And I don't mean to overstress those terms, but it is important to understand the difference. And this was a vision which very much got widespread support from the middle classes, who saw Hitler as a protector of their wealth and privilege, who were fiercely patriotic and either actively anti-Semitic or willing to kind of ignore it in exchange for a modicum of stability. It's also worth bearing in mind that you can often judge political movements by the company that they keep, and Hitler made sure to court the key right-wing figures across German society, from reactionary numbers like Hindenburg, for example, to political figures like von Papen and Kurt von Schleicher, all of whom would go on to provide him with crucial support that got him into power in 1933, and all of whom abhorred socialism too. Moreover, Hitler was a shrewd populist. He used language and ideas and stroked the ego of his listeners by appealing to their hearts and not their heads. So, for example, he blamed outside forces for pretty much all of the ills of Germany, neatly absolving his audience of any responsibility for maybe their own shortcomings and failures, or indeed his own. He was good at summoning up images of an imagined past and a potential future that he could bring about if only his enemies were destroyed. He regularly attacked the free press, democracy, and his political opponents, blaming them for things which they may or may not have done, and indeed blaming them for things that he'd done. He didn't really have a great grasp of economics full stop, and he just simply promised something to everybody at some point. More jobs for the unemployed, more money for households, lower taxes for the rich, without really considering how to pay for any of that. Of course, he was keen on the military, having been a military man himself. He was leveraging the popular support for the army amongst the general population of German people and used it as a tool to gain popularity for himself. Married to this were a number of tactical innovations. He would, for example, be deliberately irrational. He would display anger to cow his enemies and fire up his supporters. He would play the victim even when he was being the aggressor. He would break conventions and norms wherever he could. He would ignore the legal implications of his pronouncements, acting and trusting that his lawyers would simply clear up after him. He also made extensive use of propaganda. Most famously, he had Joseph Goebbels to do that kind of stuff for him, reaching out to people through film and radio and newsreels and symbology and colour and design and uniforms and massed rallies, and not just relying on newspapers and posters which had been used in the past. He made violence a part of his campaigning toolkit, and he refused to disavow gangs when they beat his opposition up, or indeed members of the press, all of which added to his appeal in a broad base of German people. And if any of that sounds familiar, I'm sure I can't possibly imagine why. In the following 3 years, little by little, as the German economy continued to tank and the Weimar Republic entered its political death spiral, the VFR was absorbed fully into the army. It didn't happen all at once, and it was never official, but increasingly the practical research that they were doing was going on to how to apply rockets to the battlefield, not how to go to space. But what Rolf Engel didn't know then, and he probably never found out, was that Werner von Braun had actually done a deal with the army back in 1931 to get a regular salary for his rocket research, and in the process neatly aligning himself with his new bosses of the VFR, Herr Dicketh and Karl Emil Becker, and cutting Rolf completely out. Von Braun probably did this for good old-fashioned rivalry reasons, and he was about to get a lot worse. To keep his profile up, and in the spirit of scientific exploration, Rolf Engel had made the mistake of engaging with the international rocket scene. He'd written to a number of leading rocket scientists in the USA, Great Britain, France and Russia on a pretty regular basis, even proposing to bring a group of bright young men to the Soviet Union on an exchange tour in 1932. And in amongst all of this, he was promoting his own ideas around liquid-fueled rockets. The advantage of liquid fuel is that not just can you throttle up and down, but you can also shut down and restart mid-flight, say for course corrections. And you can also direct the thrust much more easily, allowing more control whilst you're in flight. High-propellant liquid-fueled rockets normally have some kind of an oxidizer and a fuel. Mix the two together and then burn them and you get boom out of the back, which is how a rocket flies. Rolf Engel thought it might be worth exploring a number of different ways to get this done. There were various acids, for example, or maybe something like hydrogen peroxide could be used, or maybe there was something else. The problem was that von Braun had told his bosses that there was only one way to make this happen: liquid oxygen. And this was a problem because he'd been relieving the army of considerable sums of money and hadn't got much in the way of results. The army also believed that there was only one way to do this, and Engel was saying something different. He was contradicting the entire army high command, which he couldn't be allowed to do. Famously, in a series of massive strategic political blunders, Adolf Hitler was appointed as Chancellor of the Reichstag in January of 1933. For Rolf Engel, this probably should have been a bit of a moment to cheer, not because he was a Nazi per se, but like a lot of people, he wanted stability and certainty and a greater Germany, and the Nazis seemed to offer it. Except, in April, Rolf was arrested for the highly plausible-sounding charge of negligent treason. In prison, somewhat inevitably, he got a variety of diseases, as well as having had the shit kicked out of him on a regular basis. He also managed to find out why he'd been arrested, because he wasn't told initially, and it turned out that it was his old boss, Karl Becker, at the VFR, now in charge of the Army Ordnance Office. Becker probably did this fundamentally because he believed that Werner von Braun was the more promising scientist, and there are two essentially competing narratives of what happened. The first one, maintained by Werner von Braun for most of his life, was that Becker wanted all rocketry under army control, in line with an alleged order from Hitler, and Rolf had refused to toe the line and join the army. In this version of events, when von Braun learned about Rolf's arrest, he immediately confronted Becker, who arranged for Rolf's release. And this is certainly possible. But in time, Rolf would come to believe that something quite different had happened. Of the leading figures within the VFR, really, Rolf and von Braun were the primary workers on liquid-fueled rockets, the others being more interested in powdered fuel or solid fuels. That meant Rolf was the rival of von Braun's for the army's funding and attention, and given Rolf's clear right-wing proclivities demonstrated by his joining of the Nationalschulze Deutsche Studenten, he would probably have been the more natural choice for Karl Becker to back in the New World Order, unless, of course, he was discredited somehow by, say, someone denouncing him, someone like von Braun. Rolf was never actually able to prove this theory, but it is somewhat indicative of the general craziness in the Nazi world. This was a space in which competing rivals would be encouraged on a regular basis to denounce one another. To quote Hitler, "Let the strongest rise above the weak." Either way, after a few months, Rolf became dangerously ill and he was released. This is not that unusual for this phase of Nazi Germany. During the first few months of 1933, the rule of law in Germany had almost completely disintegrated, with enemies of the Nazis being arrested and thrown into jail or into so-called wild concentration camps where they were routinely tortured, beaten and starved, only to be released shortly thereafter. Given our discussions of a moment ago, it is worth pointing out that these were primarily Jews or socialists of various types, like for example Social Democrats and Communists and Social Workers' Party members. The idea was both to subdue potential opponents of the state directly, through the victims, and indirectly by then releasing those victims back into the population where they could tell their tales of woe and fear. That said, being released as quickly as Rolf was a little bit unusual and potentially a little bit suspicious. And now comes probably the most jarring part of Rolf Engel's tale. Having been imprisoned by the regime, one might imagine, not unreasonably, that he'd, maybe reach out to the French Deuxième Bureau and pass across secrets of German rocketry in exchange for passage out of the country. Or maybe he'd realise that his rampant anti-Semitism was misplaced and, smuggle Jews out of Germany being commemorated in Israel after the war as righteous amongst nations. Or perhaps he'd simply emigrate to anywhere that wasn't Germany and offer his services overseas to hide from the Nazi state. Oh no, he joined the fucking SA. For those who perhaps don't know, the SA, or brown shirts, were a bunch of armed thugs in uniform who acted as the enforcement arm of the Nazi Party. Think about it, I don't know, a bit like, let's say, the Proud Boys working for Trump, only more organised and with proper uniforms and without the pathetic whinging about not getting laid. During the 1920s and 30s, these bastards went around kicking the ever-living shit out of opponents, and in the spring and summer of 1933, they were going completely nuts across Germany. When Hitler was made Chancellor in January of that year, he'd promised to bring an end to democracy. By March of 1933, he had managed, partly by getting the SA to arrest all of the communists, and by passing something called the Enablement Act to take complete control over the Reichstag. This let Hitler declare a state of emergency and rule by decree. Effectively, the Reichstag voted to dissolve itself, and the SA had played an important part by merrily kicking the living shit out of anybody who'd look like they might vote against it, which is perhaps worth bearing in mind if paramilitaries turn up near the seat of your democracy. Just saying. As 1933 progressed, the SA were the ones that were behind the wild concentration camps. They were the ones doing the arresting of unfortunate Jews and social and political enemies. Also, they were crucial to consolidating power underneath the Nazi Party by spreading themselves out across the German states. What would happen, essentially, is that the SA would organise a protest at a local government office building and take it over. The Nazi Party would, of course, step in to mediate, and then having, quote, listened to the people, they would, reluctantly, of course, appoint one of their own officials to take over the whole of the local government, dispatch one of their political appointees to take over the local police and municipal functions. And in this way, what had been quite a good federal system under the Weimar Republic was now a completely centralised organisation. And the SA were crucial to making that happen. They were the ones that organised boycotts of Jewish shops. They were the ones that agitated for Jews to have their citizenship revoked. And they were constantly challenging the army, demanding promotions of sympathetic supporters and the removal of rivals. And crucially to our discussion at this point, it's important to remember that one of their key demands was that Germany was put into a state of permanent revolution. The SA wanted the old ways disbanded and their own people, and indeed their own functions, put in their place. The SA was run by a chap called Ernst Röhm. He was a former army officer, an anti-Semite of the First Order, a ruthless bastard who enjoyed beating his opponents with rubber truncheons, and about as close to an openly gay man as the Nazi state ever came. Röhm felt that, with 1 million men in uniform and 4.5 million other members across the country, he rather outnumbered the 100,000 men of the army, and that he, Ernst Röhm, should be running the armed forces of Germany, not the posh Prussian pricks who hadn't changed since the Kaiser's day. As you might imagine, the army were fucking thrilled by the idea of having a fat gay man and his political gang members taking over the pride of Germany. When, in late 1933, Rolf managed to get a meeting through a mutual friend with both Röhm and his deputy Fritz von Krause, it's fair to say that tensions between the army, Hitler and the SA were incredibly high. It is worth remembering that Röhm represented probably the only man in Germany at that point who could have rivaled Hitler for control of the country and the Nazi Party. Rolf got his meeting for two reasons. One was his technical understanding of rocketry, which was very interesting to Röhm and von Krause, but also because he was avowedly anti-army, which chimed beautifully with Röhm's personal perspective. And off the back of this meeting, Rolf was assigned to something called the Versuchsabteilung, or test section of the SA's Luftstaffel, or air defence section, which itself was within the SA's Deutsche Luftwaffe, or German Air Guard. Let me just say that again. Röhm had not just raised an alternative army, but an alternative air force, and in that, an alternative anti-aircraft section, and within that, a fucking rocket testing group. He was not, pardon my French, fucking about when he said he was going to overthrow the armed forces. I just want to make sure that you're fully across what I'm saying here. Have it in your brain as we go forward. At this time, at this moment, Rolf has been released after a matter of weeks for high treason. He's still under Gestapo surveillance, and he's gone to go and meet the man who's openly agitating for further revolution within what is now a dictatorial state. Moreover, where most people got turned away, Rolf had managed to get through the door because of his specialist knowledge of rockets and his hatred of the army, and meet the two key protagonists in this story. And then he's been assigned by them to a subgroup of a subgroup of a subgroup that, of course, officially doesn't exist. Okay then. As 1933 turned into 1934, Hitler had more and more of a problem. I mean, he had many problems, including being a giant piece of shit with no social skills, but he had a more practical political problem. Adolf's delightful worldview was of course built on the idea that everything bad was Jewish and everything Jewish was bad, and so as a result, Germany was not responsible for the outbreak of World War I, that was the Jews. Germany was not defeated in World War I, that was stabbed in the back by the Jews. The Treaty of Versailles was grossly unfair, and you've guessed it, also the work of the Jews. I do sometimes wonder what would have happened if he'd ever found out about the space lasers. We've talked a couple of times about Hitler's overall goals here. What he was trying to do was to overcome the Versailles Treaty, undo the humiliating defeat of 1918, and then build a greater Germany. And to do that, he needed the army to be armed to the teeth and, crucially, to be loyal to him. To ensure stability in Germany, he also needed to make sure that he had the white-collar workers on his side too. And in order to make sure that he could give the weapons to the army that they would need to build the greater Germany and to be able to get their loyalty, he needed the large capitalists on side too. For example, the men from Krupp and BMW, IG Farben, United Steel, Siemens, AEG and Daimler-Benz and so on. All of these groups wanted stability, and certainly not the fucking SA running amok with the so-called permanent state of revolution. Rome's days were therefore numbered. The first moves were fairly gentle. Hitler gave a speech warning of the need for stability. Then the wild concentration camps were shut down. Various boycotts that the SA were organised were quietly shelved. But the message wasn't getting through to Rome. In March of 1934, Göring made a play for, and indeed got, the entire air arm of the SA, folding the whole thing back into the German Air Sport League, which would become the basis of the Luftwaffe. For Rolf, that meant that yet again his research and power base was being broken up in a political fight between the Nazis. But he had, in fact, even if he didn't know it at the time, got off incredibly lightly. Just 9 weeks later, on the 28th of June 1934, the SS and the army, backed by Hitler, burst into SA barracks across Germany, arresting key figures from the organisation and murdering them in what became known as the Night of the Long Knives. By the time the dust settled, at least 90 were dead, hundreds had been arrested, and the SA's power base was destroyed forever. Ernst Röhm and Fritz von Krause were both executed without trial, as indeed was former left-wing Nazi Gregor Strasser. His brother Otto managed to flee the country just in time. This marked the end of both the left wing of the Nazi Party and interference by conservatives outside of the party. Rolf claimed for the rest of his life to have been completely shocked by these killings, but the timing is suspect. He was under Gestapo surveillance when he met Röhm. They knew that he had a unique background that would make him incredibly attractive to the SA and probably be able to get him into the organisation. And they also knew that he was completely flat broke. When the dust settled, basically everyone he'd worked with had been shot, arrested or had fled Germany. Just Rolf seemed to breeze through all of this just fine somehow. In fact, he accepted a flight training position with a salary despite having serious health problems and no interest in flying whatsoever. Still, it's not like he met Heydrich or anything. In 1936, with the Berlin Olympics looming on the horizon, Hitler had made a call to gently ease back on some of the pressures that he'd been putting on his political opponents and on Jewish people, so that the Olympics could pass off in an air of, if not exactly collegial cooperation, then perhaps less intimidation. But the moment that it was all over, some 11,000 opponents were arrested almost overnight, and strict implementation of the race laws were beginning to be enforced. German rearmament, which had become public knowledge in 1935, went into another gear, and what we think of as the Nazi state of 1939 really started to emerge. Meanwhile, Rolf dropped out of both his rocketry studies and also of flight school and became a member of a thing called the Reichsstudentenverein, or RSF, and I'm sorry about the pronunciation. This was the body which basically ran the student union societies across German universities. Students being students and interested in new ideas meant that the RSF was of interest to certain state security services. So, you see, the thing is, it turned out here that the Sicherheitsdienst, or the SD, were funding and spying on the RSF. For those that may be not that familiar, the SD were the intelligence arm of Heinrich Himmler's motherfucking SS. So that's cool. Rolf was now 100% a bad guy. And off the back of this, with his connections, he got a meeting with Reinhard Heydrich to talk about potential rocket programs that the SS might be interested in adopting. Now, Heydrich is one of the biggest pieces of shit in human history. He's the fucker who was responsible for the so-called Jewish question. He's the bastard who encouraged Jews to flee Germany whilst literally stealing everything off their backs. And in the future, he would be the man that would organise the Wannsee Conference, the one where the architecture of the death camps was put into place. Following this meeting, the Gestapo tales were called off. Rolf was made an unpaid agent of the SD, reporting on his activities to the RSF, and one of Heydrich's subordinates made sure that Rolf could join the Nazi Party for the first time. So let's just do a very quick recap here. In just less than the 4 years that the Nazis had been powerful, Rolf had seen his beloved VFD turned into a branch of the army. He'd been arrested as a traitor in what amounted to an office spat. He'd joined the SA and narrowly escaped with his life. He'd been followed for 3 years. He was now spying on a student body that he was also working for, whilst being a member of the Nazi Party, and he was doing it on behalf of another part of the Nazi Party. Welcome to the wacky and wonderful world of Nazi internal politics. Fast forward 2 relatively dull years for Rolf. In September of 1939, war broke out. Now, Rolf claims that he fought in the Polish campaign, but he didn't, because we have letters proving that he was in Munich, begging for a full-time job with the SD. In fact, he wanted to have his cake and eat it, because he wanted to join the SD but then to be posted to Danzig, where he could take a doctorate in rockets on the SS's dime. And they told him basically, and not unreasonably, to go and do one, and this probably saved his life post-war. Pretty much all of the SD men who went into Poland in 1939 wound up joining the Einsatzgruppen, the death squads, who shot more than 20,000 people in the opening months of the war in Poland alone, and they would go on to be responsible for what's known as the Holocaust with bullets that preceded the gas chambers. In the end, the SD changed their minds. They did in fact want him in the SS after all, and they posted him as part of a secret police battalion into Alsace, formerly part of France but now claimed by Germany. It's a whole historical thing, and I'm not going to go into it except to say that the Nazis were determined to make Alsace part of the Third Reich proper. So now this young rocket scientist turned Nazi party apprentice was going to help. Help how, you might ask? Oh, only by deporting 45,000 French men, women and children from their province. Nice. They were loaded onto trucks and either dumped into Vichy, France, or taken directly to new concentration camps built for the purpose. Hundreds died in the process. For those who remained in Alsace, Rolf had a special treat in store, completing something called the Names Action. From the 1st of January 1939, Jews were required to change their names to either Israel for men or Sarah for women. By this point, they had lost not just their careers and their citizenship and then their businesses and then their homes, but now they were even stripped of their fucking names. But why waste a great idea when you've got one, right? So Rolf's job in Alsace was to erase the names that were too French and make them more German-sounding. Congratulations, Henri, you are now either Heinrich or you're going to go to the fucking camps. All of this worked out great for him, and he was rapidly promoted for his highly efficient work and diligent National Socialist zeal. Except there was one slight problem. Rolf, being the egotist that he was claiming to be a doctor of engineering whilst he was in France, but he was no such thing. He'd never even actually completed his degree, and someone somewhere reported him and he was swiftly found out. Moreover, as is traditional with authoritarian regimes, when someone is accused of something else, they are also accused of corruption, and the authorities exiled him back to the Reich. Now, you'd like to think that that's the end of that. He'd fucked up, he'd be arrested or something and slung in jail. Well, then you'd be thinking like a weak and decadent Westerner, because instead he was promoted to Hauptsturmführer, or captain, and set up with his own rocket business called VA Grossendorf in Danzig. So how the hell do we explain this 1 minute disgrace, next minute rockets for profit turnaround? Well, pretty simple really. Massive corruption. He'd definitely been skimming money off in France, and now he used that in the East, probably through SS accounts to make sure that it was all done properly. Either way, he was going to go and get to bring the kaboom for the first time since 1934. And in very short order, he'd built an 8cm fin-stabilised rocket launcher that the SS called the Raketenfeichenwerfer. And no, I've said that completely wrong, but I've put links in the description. Whatever. What he was doing here was essentially taking the Soviet Katyushka rocket system and making it bigger. The Katyushka could fire an entire volley in something like 20 to 30 seconds, so Rolf's system went faster, much faster. It fired these rockets in about between 2 and 4 seconds. That is a hell of a lot of kaboom in a very short space. And because of the way that the launcher itself was designed, he could actually fit in a second salvo, making this thing multi-use, which made it pretty unique. He delivered this in early 1942, so well in fact that the SS's head of ordnance appointed him to the Armaments Commission for the entire Reich, which basically let him write contracts for his own firm whilst absolutely fucking over any program that the army put forward, not least, for example, by massively delaying components within the V2 rocket program through the offensive use of bureaucracy. As battlefield defeats for the army mounted, the SS swept in, took advantage, building basically a parallel set of weapons and procurement processes. By Rolf's own estimation, there were something like 80 projects across the Luftwaffe, the SS and the Army, and as many as 240 different types of rockets at various stages of development. And all of this gave him an awful lot of room for manoeuvre. But this was a two-way street. Having delivered his 8cm rocket system in 1942, it wasn't actually adopted until late 1944 as a result of the Army fighting back and doing its level best to make sure that whatever program he was involved in was stopped and blocked. And this, kids, is how you get 1,400 changes to the Tiger tank, and you find that they're only built in parallel batches of 6. By August 1944, things did seem to improve for Rolf. In fact, he'd managed to get his 8cm rocket program accepted, and he was also making R4M air-to-air rockets now, so beloved of War Thunder players and pilots of the Me-262. He was also getting stuck into the Nazi air-to-ground rocket program, championing a thing called the Rheinmaiden, which basically burned about 250 kilograms of fuel in a second, and, it was exploding quite a lot, but the theory was good. Unfortunately for Rolf, however, the Soviets were being most unreasonable, advancing really quite fast towards his business. So in September of 1944, he bravely ran away to Czechoslovakia. He took with him just 30 out of the 250 members of the staff that had worked for him, leaving the rest to the tender mercies of the Red Army. There he and his team joined nearly 300 German and Czech scientists already working at a site near Pribram, which pre-war had hosted a Czech idea to launch postal rockets from Europe to the US. It's kind of a shame that didn't work out. I mean, who doesn't want to see intercontinental ballistic airmail? Rolf's business might have been destroyed, but neither that nor the impending collapse of the Third Reich seems to have slowed him down any. According to his right-hand man, a Swedish national and all-round con artist, Niels Weber Larsen, they were working on something called the V101 program at Pribram. Allegedly, this was a massive 140-ton, 1,800-kilometer ranged monster there to try and hit Moscow, as well as something which was elusively referred to as the acoustic rocket, whatever the fuck that was. Brave Sir Rolf then developed a very unfortunate slight limp or a bit of a cough or something because, unfortunately, due to, quotes, poor health, he was forced to resign from the board on the 1st of April 1945, whereupon he bravely ran away. Again. It turned out, fortunately, that he was plenty well enough to assemble a convoy of trucks and drive as fast as possible across the Reich to the Western Front, where he accidentally wound up surrendering to the Americans. Poor chap. Once again, of course, he was leaving behind an unknown number of forced labourers to the tender mercies of the Soviet forces. As was their wont at this time, the Americans made him an offer of employment, but this would have required him to work with Werner von Braun, who he strongly suspected may have been responsible for his arrest back in 1933, so Rolf politely declined, instead going to work for the French in 1946. In 1953, he moved to Cairo to go and help NASA design rockets to shoot at Israel. There is a whole story there about how many Nazis actually wound up helping the Egyptians to develop ballistic missiles and firing both explosive and indeed biological weapons if the rumours are true. We'll have to come back to that one day. His CIA file shows two things at this time. One, that he remained in contact with a number of former Nazis who'd fled to Argentina, and he was offered work by Peron but preferred to stay in Egypt. Secondly, he got pretty pissed off with the Egyptians over time, which resulted in him offering to spy for both the CIA and the French Deuxième Bureau. This was dangerous and stupid, and in 1957 it looks like he had to flee the country, washing up in Italy. After 4 years doing God knows what for the Italian government, he returned to Germany and joined a company called MBB, or to give it its full name, Messerschmitt Blanco Blum, as head of its space division. So it only took him from 1933 to 1961 to finally get round to designing a civilian application for his rockets, and he was getting to do it in the company of some good old friends. Great. In 1993 he died quietly at home. Rocket Rolf remained a Nazi until his death. He'd been a fully paid-up member of the party and then the SS, and he brought hook, line and sinker into the nationalist and anti-Semitic values and culture around him. But he was also a rational man, a brilliant designer, an energetic organiser, and probably the smartest man in every room that he ever walked into. And yet he, as an intelligent man, still fell for the Nazi bullshit, and he went with it because it felt emotionally right and good. Probably that's worth considering the next time you meet somebody who's very, very bright but also a Charlie Unit November Tango. Alright, look, so some of you might be a little bit cross at this point, because not just was this not a video about the Me-163 comet, it also turns out it wasn't really about a load of rockets, and I'm sorry for that. Well, kind of. As a case study of how not to quite get chewed up and spat out by the Nazi regime, it really is quite impressive. He was part of some 14 Nazi organisations at one point or another, many of which treated competing in the Nazi state as a blood sport. I've done my best to fact-check all of this, but of course a lot of it's coming from Rolf's own accounts, and he lied for the whole of his life about what he was doing and when he was doing it, and of course most of the people involved, in fact pretty much all of them, are dead now, so it's very, very hard to know if we've got this completely correct. If I have made factual errors, I will let you know, and I'll do my best to put them right. And at this point it feels appropriate to acknowledge the extraordinarily beautiful, attractive, intelligent, well-dressed and sophisticated humans who decided to join up as patrons. Thank you, and thanks to your help, Jenkins and I can enjoy the occasional dram together, and her ladyship can replace her riding instructor as often as she wants. Meanwhile, I really should get back to trying to read those ME163 books that you lot have helped me to fund. I will see you all very soon.